The rain came down so hard that night that Lyra could barely see her own hands in front of her face, and that was the moment her mate stood in front of the whole pack and told everyone she meant nothing to him. Her heart was already breaking before he opened his mouth. She had felt the bond pulling thin for weeks, like a rope fraying strand by strand, but nothing could have prepared her for the words that came next. Daniel, the beta of the Ashwood pack, stood on the raised stone platform where every important announcement was made, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet hers. "I reject Lyra as my mate," he said, and his voice carried over the crowd like thunder. "She is weak. She brings nothing to this pack. I choose Grace instead." A gasp rippled through the gathered wolves. Grace stood beside him, her chin lifted, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Lyra felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. The bond that had connected her to Daniel for 3 years snapped inside her chest, with a pain sharper than any wound. She staggered back, one hand pressed to her heart, gasping for air that would not come. Nobody moved to help her. That was the cruelest part. The pack she had grown up in, the wolves she had shared meals with, hunted with, laughed with, all stood in silence and watched her fall to her knees in the mud. And Omega, who had been rejected, held no value to them anymore. She was already invisible. "Get up," Daniel said, his voice flat and cold. "You are no longer welcome here. Leave before sunrise." Lyra raised her head, rain mixed with the tears sliding down her face, so no one could tell the difference. She looked at Grace, who did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She looked at the pack members who had once called her friend, now staring at their feet or turning away entirely. And then she looked at Daniel, searching his face for even a flicker of regret. She found none. 3 years, she whispered, so quietly that only the wolves closest to her could hear. 3 years, and this is how you end it. It was never a real bond, Daniel said. You were always going to be a burden. Grace is stronger. Grace will give this pack real strength. What could you ever give us? You can barely shift on command. The crowd murmured in agreement, and something inside Lyra went very quiet and very still. She had spent years trying to prove herself worthy, training long after the others had gone to rest, pushing her body past exhaustion, trying to make her shift as fast and as strong as the alphas and betas around her. It had never been enough. Now she understood it never would be. She stood on her own, refusing the hand that no one offered anyway. Her legs shook, but she forced them to hold her weight. She would not collapse in front of these people again. She would not give them that. "Fine," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I will leave, but know this. You did not break me tonight. You only showed me who you really are." Daniel's eyes flickered, just for a second, something like surprise crossing his face at her defiance. But he said nothing. Grace laughed softly, a sound like breaking glass, and looped her arm through his. Lyra turned and walked away from the platform, from the pack house, from the only home she had ever known. Nobody followed her. Nobody called her back. The rain swallowed the sound of her footsteps as she crossed the training grounds where she had spent countless hours trying to earn a place that was never truly hers to keep. She did not go back to the small cabin she had shared with Daniel. There was nothing there that belonged to her anymore. Not really. Instead, she walked straight to the edge of pack territory, past the old oak tree that marked the boundary, and kept walking, even after the borders were long behind her. The forest at night was not kind to a wolf traveling alone, especially not in a storm like this one. Every snap of a branch made her flinch. Every shadow looked like a threat. She had grown up hearing stories about the dangers that lurked beyond pack borders. Rogue wolves who attacked without warning. Wild animals that did not care about pack law. Hunters who saw any wolf as a prize. But staying meant enduring the pity and the scorn of people who had already decided she was worthless. Walking into the unknown felt safer than that. By the time the storm eased into a light drizzle, Lyra had put many miles between herself and the pack she used to call home. Her paws, still in human feet since her rejection, had left her too raw with pain to attempt a shift, were cut and bruised from the rocky ground. She found a small hollow beneath the roots of an old fallen tree and crawled inside, curling herself into the smallest shape she could manage, trying to hold on to whatever warmth her body had left. She did not sleep. She simply existed in that hollow, replaying the moment over and over, trying to understand where it had all gone wrong. Had she truly been so weak? Had she truly given nothing? She thought of all the small moments she had shared with Daniel, moments she had believed were real. Maybe none of it had mattered to him at all. When the first gray light of morning crept through the trees, Lyra finally allowed herself to cry, not the quiet tears of shock she had shed in front of the pack, but deep, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the years she had wasted trying to earn love that was never going to be given freely. She cried for the home she no longer had. She cried until there was nothing left inside her but a strange, hollow calm. It was in that calm that something shifted inside her. She would not go crawling back. She would not beg any pack to take her in as a pitiful reject. She would learn to survive on her own, and she would build a life that owed nothing to anyone who had cast her aside. She wiped her face, forced herself to her feet, and started walking again, this time with purpose, instead of despair guiding her steps. Over the following days, Lyra pushed deeper into unclaimed territory, land that belonged to no pack, wild and untamed, and dangerous in its own quiet way. She learned quickly that survival required a different kind of strength than the one she had been taught to value back home. It was not about impressing anyone or proving herself in front of a crowd. It was about finding water, finding food, finding shelter before the temperature dropped at night. She found a stream on the third day, and drank until her thirst finally eased. She caught small fish with her bare hands after failing a dozen times, laughing at herself the first time she succeeded, a strange broken sound that surprised her, because she had not thought she had any laughter left. She built a crude shelter out of branches and leaves, nothing like the sturdy cabins of the pack, but enough to keep the worst of the wind away. Each small success felt like a tiny victory, a proof to herself that Daniel had been wrong about her. She was not helpless. She had simply never been given the chance to discover what she could do outside the shadow of a pack that only measured her worth by how well she served others. On the fifth night, exhausted and aching, Lyra finally attempted her shift. She had avoided it since the rejection, afraid of what it might feel like now that the bond inside her was broken, afraid that the pain might be too much to bear, but she needed her wolf form to hunt properly, to move faster, to keep herself safer through the long nights ahead. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and let the change take her. It hurt, but not in the way she feared. The transformation rippled through her body, bones shifting, fur spreading across her skin, and when it was finished, she stood on 4 paws for the first time since that terrible night. She let out a long, low howl, not a cry of pain this time, but something closer to release. The sound echoed through the trees, carrying every ounce of grief and anger and stubborn hope she had been holding inside. For the first time in days, she felt like herself again. She spent the following weeks establishing a small camp near the stream where she had first found water, close enough to the river that fed into it for fishing, far enough from any marked pack territory that she felt reasonably safe. She built a proper shelter this time, reinforced with mud and stone, learning from her mistakes each time the wind threatened to tear her first attempts apart. She set simple snares for rabbits and small game, taught herself which berries were safe by watching which ones the birds ate first, found a cave nearby that she used for storage when she managed to catch more than she could eat in a single sitting. Her hands, once soft and unused to hard labor, grew calloused and strong. Her body, once thin from years of being overlooked at pack meals, filled out with a lean, quiet strength born from necessity. She was, against every expectation the pack had placed on her, surviving. Some nights the loneliness crept in anyway. No matter how busy she kept her hands during the day, she would sit by her small fire, listening to the sounds of the forest, and wonder if anyone back at Ashwood Pack ever thought about her at all, or if she had already faded from their memory the moment she crossed the border. She wondered if Daniel and Grace were happy together, if the pack was thriving under their new bond, if any of it had been worth the pain she still carried in her chest like a stone. But then morning would come, and she would remind herself that dwelling on the past would not fill her stomach or keep her warm. She had a life to build, even if it was a small and solitary one, even if no one else would ever know how hard she had worked to build it. Weeks passed this way, each day blending into the next in a steady rhythm of survival. Lyra grew more confident in her wolf form, learning the layout of the surrounding forest, the best hunting grounds, the safest places to rest. She avoided the paths that other wolves seemed to use, keeping to the parts of the forest that felt untouched and quiet. She told herself she preferred it this way. No pack meant no rejection. No bonds meant no heartbreak. If she kept herself apart from others, nothing could ever hurt her the way Daniel had. It was a lonely kind of peace, but it was hers, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Autumn crept in slowly, painting the leaves gold and red, and Lyra found a strange kind of beauty in watching the forest change around her. She had never had the time to notice things like this back at the pack, always too busy trying to prove herself, always too anxious about disappointing someone. Out here, alone, she finally had the space to simply exist, to watch the world shift and change, without needing to perform for anyone. She often walked along the river that fed her small stream, drawn by the sound of the water rushing over stones, finding a strange comfort in its constant motion. It reminded her, in a way she could not quite explain, that things kept moving forward, even when it felt like her own life had stopped the night Daniel rejected her. She did not know, as she walked those quiet riverbanks collecting firewood and thinking about nothing in particular, that her life was about to change again, in a way she could never have predicted. She did not know that the very river she found so peaceful would soon carry something toward her that would test everything she believed about herself, about strength, about who deserved kindness and who did not. For now, she simply walked, breathing in the crisp autumn air, feeling, for the first time in months, something that almost resembled hope. Somewhere far beyond the borders of the forest she now called home, in a kingdom she had never heard of and could not have imagined, a war was quietly building. Alliances were shifting, old enemies were sharpening their claws, and the most powerful alpha in the region was about to find himself running for his life through unfamiliar territory, bleeding and desperate, with nowhere left to turn. Lyra had no way of knowing any of this as she gathered her firewood and watched the sun sink low over the water. She only knew that the ache in her chest had grown a little quieter with each passing day, and that tomorrow she would wake up and survive again, just as she had every day since the rejection that had once felt like the end of everything. She could not have guessed that soon survival would mean something entirely different, that the next storm to roll through her small corner of the forest would bring with it a wounded stranger whose fate would become tangled with her own, in ways neither of them could foresee. The forest grew dark around her as she made her way back to her shelter, the last light of day fading behind the tree line. She banked her fire, ate a small meal of roasted fish, and settled in for another quiet night, unaware that everything was about to change. The storm arrived without warning, on a night that had started out calm and clear. Lyra had grown used to reading the sky over the past weeks, learning to predict rain from the way the clouds gathered over the western ridge, but this storm broke the pattern entirely. One moment the stars were visible through the canopy above her shelter, and the next, the wind had picked up so violently that branches began snapping around her, forcing her to retreat deeper into the stone alcove she had built for exactly this kind of emergency. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the storm rage outside, grateful for the shelter that had taken her so long to build properly. It had not always been this sturdy. Her first attempts, back when she barely understood how to survive alone, had collapsed under far gentler winds than this. She had learned through failure, through cold nights and soaked belongings, exactly what it took to keep herself safe. Thunder rolled across the sky, so loud it seemed to shake the ground beneath her, and lightning split the darkness in jagged white lines. Lyra pressed her hands over her ears, waiting for the worst of it to pass, thinking only of how grateful she would be when morning finally came, and she could assess whatever damage the storm had left behind. The days had settled into a rhythm she had grown to appreciate, quiet and predictable, filled with the simple tasks of survival that left little room for the ache still living in her chest. She checked her snares each morning, gathered fresh water from the stream, foraged for whatever the season offered, and spent her evenings mending tools, or simply sitting by the fire, watching the flames, and letting her mind wander somewhere far from the pack that had cast her out. She had stopped counting the days since her rejection. At first she had marked them carefully, as though tracking the wound might help it heal faster, but somewhere along the way the counting had started to feel pointless. What mattered was not how long ago it happened, but how far she had come since then, how much stronger and more capable she had become through sheer necessity. Tonight, though, all her careful routines meant nothing against the fury of the storm. She stayed curled in her alcove for what felt like hours, listening to the wind howl through the trees, until finally, Sometime near midnight, the worst of it began to ease. The thunder grew more distant. The rain softened from a violent downpour to a steady, manageable fall. Lyra allowed herself to relax slightly, thinking the danger had passed. That was when she heard it, faint beneath the sound of the rain and the rushing river nearby, a sound that did not belong to the storm at all. A howl, low and pained, carried on the wind from the direction of the water. She froze, straining to listen, wondering if she had imagined it. The forest could play tricks on the ears during a storm, wind bending sound in strange directions, branches creaking in ways that mimicked animal cries. But then it came again, closer this time, unmistakably a cry of pain rather than a natural sound of the storm. Every instinct she had built over the past weeks told her to stay exactly where she was. She had made it a point to avoid other wolves entirely, to keep herself hidden and safe from anyone who might see an Omega alone in the wilderness, as an easy target, rather than someone deserving of help. Getting involved with whatever was happening out there could be dangerous. It could be a trap. It could be nothing at all, some trick of her exhausted mind after weeks of solitude. But the howl came a third time, weaker now, edged with something that sounded almost like desperation, and Lyra found she could not simply sit there and ignore it. She grabbed the small knife she had fashioned from a sharpened stone, more out of habit than any real belief it would protect her, and pushed her way out of the alcove into the rain. The storm had softened but not stopped entirely, and within moments she was soaked through, her hair plastered to her face as she made her way toward the sound. The river, usually a gentle, meandering thing that fed her stream, had transformed into something far more violent under the weight of the storm. The water churned and rushed, swollen far beyond its normal banks, carrying debris and broken branches downstream at a frightening speed. And there, caught in the current, struggling against the pull of the water, was a wolf. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The animal was enormous, far larger than any wolf she had ever seen, with a coat so dark it seemed to disappear into the shadows, except where the moonlight caught the wet fur. Even from this distance, even through the chaos of the storm, she could see the dark stains along his side, blood mixing with rainwater, could see the way his movements had grown sluggish and uncoordinated as the current dragged him toward a bend in the river, where jagged rocks jutted out of the water. He was drowning. Whatever strength he had left was failing against the force of the flood, and if the current carried him into those rocks, the impact alone might be enough to end whatever chance he had of surviving this night. Lyra did not think. She simply moved. She ran along the bank, matching the wolf's pace as best she could, scanning the water for anything she might use to help. There was no time to find rope, no time to fashion any kind of proper rescue tool. There was only the storm, the rushing water, and a creature fighting for his life, just out of her reach. She spotted a fallen tree ahead, its trunk stretching partway across the narrower section of the river, branches still tangled with roots on the bank. It was not much, but it might be enough. She scrambled toward it, ignoring the way the wet bark cut into her palms as she climbed onto the trunk, positioning herself as close to the water as she dared. The wolf was close now, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes as he struggled to keep his head above the surface. She reached out as far as she could, her fingers brushing against wet fur, and gripped hard, wrapping her other arm around the branch to anchor herself against the pull of the current. For one terrifying moment, she thought the river would win, that the force of the water would simply tear the wolf from her grip and drag them both under. Her muscles screamed with the effort of holding on, her feet slipping against the wet bark beneath her. But she held firm, gritting her teeth, pulling with everything she had left, and slowly, agonizingly, the wolf's massive body began to shift toward the bank, instead of away from it. "Come on," she gasped, though she doubted the wolf could understand her, or even hear her over the roar of the water. "Come on, just a little more." With one final, desperate pull, she managed to drag him close enough to the shallows that his paws could find purchase against the riverbed. He seemed to sense the change immediately, whatever strength he had left going toward pushing himself the rest of the way onto solid ground, until finally, both of them collapsed onto the muddy bank, soaked and shaking, well clear of the water's reach. Lyra lay there for a moment, catching her breath, her whole body trembling from the exertion and the cold. Then she remembered why she had come out here in the first place, and she forced herself upright, crawling closer to examine the wolf who lay motionless beside her. He was breathing, she noted with relief. Shallow but steady breaths that stirred the wet fur along his chest. But the wounds along his side were deep, deeper than she had first realized. Gashes that looked less like the kind of injury an animal might get from rocks in a river, and more like something deliberately inflicted, something that looked disturbingly like the marks left by claws. Whoever, or whatever, had done this to him, had meant to cause serious harm. Lyra's mind raced through everything she knew about wolves, about pack politics, about the kind of violence that sometimes erupted between rival groups fighting over territory or power. This wolf was clearly no ordinary stray. His size alone marked him as something significant, and the severity of his wounds suggested he had been running from something far more dangerous than a simple accident. She should leave him here. That was the safe choice, the choice that kept her hidden and uninvolved in whatever conflict had led to this. If whoever attacked him came looking, she did not want to be caught in the middle of it. She had spent weeks building a life free from the dangers of pack politics, and dragging a wounded stranger into her camp risked everything she had worked so hard to establish. But looking at him now, unconscious and vulnerable, his massive form somehow appearing smaller in his current state, she knew she could not simply walk away. Whatever risk came with helping him, leaving him here to die in the cold, exposed to the elements, and whatever predator might come across an easy meal, was not something she could bring herself to do. She had been left to fend for herself once, cast aside by people who should have protected her. She would not become the kind of person who did the same thing to someone else, even a stranger, even one who might bring danger with him. Gathering her resolve, Lyra assessed the distance between the riverbank and her camp. It was not far, perhaps a quarter mile through the trees, but moving an unconscious wolf of this size would be no easy task, especially in her current exhausted state, after fighting the current to save him. She could not carry him. That much was immediately obvious. But she could not leave him exposed to the rain either, not with wounds this severe. She settled for the next best option, working quickly to construct a makeshift shelter right where he lay, using branches and her own cloak to create at least some barrier against the worst of the weather. It would not be comfortable, and it would not be permanent, but it would buy time until she could figure out how to safely move him, or until he regained enough consciousness to move himself. As she worked, rain still falling steadily around her, she found herself studying his face, in a way that felt strangely intimate given they had never properly met. Even unconscious, even in obvious pain, there was something striking about him, a strength evident even in stillness, a presence that seemed to fill the small space around them despite his current helplessness. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the practical matter of keeping him alive through the rest of the night. She cleaned what wounds she could reach without disturbing him too much, using strips torn from her own clothing since she had nothing else available in the moment, and packed mud and leaves against the worst of the bleeding, a trick she had learned from watching injured animals in the forest tend to their own wounds instinctively. By the time she finished, the rain had softened to a light drizzle, and the eastern sky had begun to show the faintest hints of gray that promised morning was not far off. Lyra sat back on her heels, exhausted beyond anything she had felt since her first days alone in the wilderness, and looked at the wolf she had pulled from the river. He still had not moved, still had not shown any sign of waking, but his breathing remained steady, and that alone felt like enough of a victory for tonight. "I don't know who you are," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, her voice barely audible over the last of the rain, "or what happened to you, but I couldn't just let you drown out there. Not after everything I've survived myself." She did not expect an answer, and she did not receive one. The wolf remained still, lost somewhere in whatever darkness his body had retreated into to heal itself. But something about speaking the words aloud, about acknowledging the strange twist her quiet, solitary night had taken, helped settle the storm of adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Lyra pulled her damp cloak tighter around her shoulders, the small comfort it offered nearly non-existent now that most of it had gone toward covering the wolf's wounds, and settled in to wait out the rest of the night beside him. She did not sleep. She could not with a stranger this dangerous-looking lying so close, not with so many questions swirling through her mind about who he was and what had happened to bring him to her river on this particular storm-filled night. But she stayed anyway, watching over him as the storm finally passed and the forest around them grew quiet, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing as proof that her decision to help him had not been in vain. Morning would bring new challenges, she knew. She would need to figure out how to move him somewhere safer, how to properly tend to wounds that clearly required more than mud and torn cloth, how to keep both of them fed and hidden should whoever hurt him come searching for their unfinished business. But for now, in the quiet hours before dawn, she simply sat beside the wolf she had saved, wondering, despite every warning instinct telling her not to, who exactly she had pulled from the river, and what strange turn her carefully rebuilt life had just taken. By the time the sun fully rose over the treetops, Lyra had made a decision. The wolf could not stay exposed on the riverbank any longer, no matter how difficult moving him would be. She had spent the last hour of darkness thinking through every possible option, and the answer kept coming back to the same conclusion. She needed to get him to her camp, where she had proper supplies, where the stone alcove would offer real protection from the elements, and where she could tend his wounds without kneeling in mud beside a swollen river that still churned dangerously close by. The problem, of course, was his size. In his wolf form, he was easily twice the size of any wolf she had encountered before, powerful even in his unconscious state, far too heavy for her to drag any real distance without risking further injury to him or serious strain to herself. She considered waiting for him to wake, but the wounds along his side worried her too much to risk further delay. Infection could set in quickly, especially with wounds that deep, and she had no way of knowing how long he had already been running, already been bleeding, before the river had finally caught him. There was only one option left, one she was hesitant to try but saw no way around. She would need to help him shift, or wait until his body did so on its own as it healed, since a human form, while still injured, would at least be small enough for her to support and guide toward her camp. Wolves in her experience tended to shift back to human form automatically once their bodies grew too exhausted or wounded to maintain the wolf shape, a kind of natural safety measure built into their biology. She had seen it happen with injured animals in the pack back home, though she had never had to manage the aftermath entirely on her own before. She settled beside him, brushing wet fur back from where it had matted against one of his wounds, and waited, watching for any sign that his body was preparing to shift. It happened faster than she expected. Within minutes, a low groan rumbled from his chest, and his form began to ripple and shrink, fur receding, limbs reshaping themselves, until where a massive black wolf had lain, there was now a man, unconscious but breathing steadily, dark hair plastered to his forehead with rain and sweat. Lyra had seen shifting before, of course, had done it herself countless times, but there was something different about witnessing it happen to a stranger, someone whose face she had never seen until this exact moment. He was, she noted with a strange jolt of surprise, remarkably handsome even in his current battered state, sharp features and a strong jaw, the kind of face that suggested authority even in complete stillness. But she pushed the observation aside quickly, focusing instead on the practical matter at hand. His wounds looked even more severe now that she could see them clearly against human skin, rather than obscured by dark fur, deep gashes along his ribs, and one particularly concerning wound along his shoulder that had bled through the makeshift bandages she had applied hours earlier. She worked quickly, using what remained of her cloak along with strips torn from her own tunic to create a proper sling that would let her support his weight enough to help him move, should he regain enough consciousness to walk with assistance. It was not an elegant solution, but it was the best option available to her. To her relief, as she worked, his eyes fluttered slightly, a low, pained sound escaping his throat. "Hey," she said softly, keeping her voice calm, despite the racing of her own heart. "Can you hear me? I need you to try to stand, just enough to help me get you somewhere safer." His eyes opened fully then, dark and unfocused, taking in his surroundings with obvious confusion, before settling on her face. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, as though trying to determine whether she was real, or some fevered dream brought on by blood loss and exhaustion. "Who?" he managed, his voice rough and barely audible. "Are you?" "My name is Lyra," she said. "I found you in the river last night. You're badly hurt. I need to get you somewhere I can properly treat your wounds, but I can't carry you on my own. Can you try to stand, even a little?" He seemed to consider this, his gaze flickering around the riverbank, taking in the muddy ground, the swollen river, the faint light of early morning. Whatever he saw seemed to convince him she was telling the truth, because after a moment, he nodded slightly, wincing at even that small movement. "Help me up," he said. Getting him to his feet was a struggle that tested every bit of strength Lyra had built over her weeks of solitary survival. He was tall, taller than she had realized even in his wolf form, and though he tried to bear as much of his own weight as possible, the effort clearly cost him greatly, his breathing growing ragged with the exertion of simply standing upright. "Slowly," she said, positioning herself under his good shoulder, letting him lean his weight against her as much as he needed. "We don't have far to go, just take it slow." The quarter-mile back to her camp felt like the longest distance Lyra had ever walked. Every few steps, the stranger would stumble, his legs threatening to give out beneath him, and she would brace herself, absorbing as much of his weight as her smaller frame could manage, refusing to let either of them fall. Sweat mixed with the last of the rain still clinging to her skin, and her arms trembled with the strain long before they finally reached the stone alcove she called home. She helped him settle onto the pile of leaves and dried grass that served as her bed, the only surface soft enough to offer him any real comfort, and immediately set to work properly examining his wounds, now that she had better light and her actual supplies at hand. "This is going to hurt," she warned him, reaching for the small pouch of dried herbs she kept for exactly this kind of emergency, remedies she had learned through careful trial and observation over her weeks alone in the forest. "I don't have anything to numb the pain, but I need to clean these wounds properly, or infection will set in." He gave a short, humorless laugh that turned into a wince. "I have endured worse." Something in the way he said it, matter of fact rather than boastful, made Lyra pause for just a moment before continuing her work. She wondered what kind of life led a person to speak so casually about enduring pain, but she did not ask. It was not her place, not yet, not when she barely knew his name. "What is your name?" she asked instead, working carefully as she cleaned the deepest of his wounds, using water she had boiled over her small fire to prevent further infection. He hesitated, just long enough that she noticed, before answering. "Kale." Just Kale. No family name, no mention of where he came from, or why he had been running through a storm, with wounds that looked deliberately inflicted. Lyra did not push for more. She understood, better than most, the instinct to guard one's past from strangers, especially when that past held pain too fresh to discuss. "Well, Kale," she said, tying off the last of her makeshift bandages, "you're safe here. For now, at least. You need rest more than anything. I'll get you water and something to eat once you're ready. But for now, just try to sleep. Your body needs to heal." He watched her with an intensity that made her slightly uncomfortable, as though he were trying to solve some puzzle he could not quite piece together. "Why did you help me?" he asked finally. "You don't know me. I could be dangerous." Lyra considered the question seriously before answering. "You were drowning," she said simply. "I couldn't just watch that happen and do nothing. Whatever you are, whoever hurt you, none of that matters when someone is dying in front of you. I've been left to fend for myself before. I know what that feels like. I wasn't going to do that to someone else." Something shifted in his expression at her words, though she could not quite read what it meant. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in details she could not begin to guess at, before finally nodding slowly, as though her answer had satisfied something he needed to understand. "Thank you," he said, and though his voice remained rough with exhaustion, the words carried a weight that suggested he did not offer them lightly. "I won't forget this." Lyra felt a strange warmth spread through her chest at his words, quickly followed by a flicker of confusion at her own reaction. She barely knew this man. She had no reason to feel anything beyond simple relief that her rescue attempt had not been in vain. And yet something about the sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at her as though truly seeing her, rather than dismissing her the way so many others had, settled somewhere deep inside her chest. She busied herself with practical tasks to avoid dwelling on the feeling too long, checking her small store of supplies, adding wood to her fire, preparing a simple broth from the last of her dried meat that might help restore some of Kale's strength once he woke again. He drifted in and out of consciousness through the rest of the morning, his body clearly demanding rest to begin the healing process properly. Lyra used the quiet hours to think through the practical challenges his presence created. Her small camp, built for one person surviving alone, would need to stretch to accommodate two, at least temporarily. Her food supplies, carefully rationed for her own needs, would need to cover his recovery as well. and there was the ever-present worry about whoever had hurt him, finding their way to her camp, searching for unfinished business. But beneath all these practical concerns sat something else entirely, a curiosity she could not quite suppress about who exactly this man was. His size, his obvious strength even in his weakened state, the deliberate nature of his wounds, all suggested he was someone of significance, someone whose absence from wherever he came from would not go unnoticed for long. She glanced over at him where he lay sleeping, his features relaxed now in a way that softened the sharp lines of his face, and wondered what kind of life he led when he was not running through storms with claw marks torn into his side. Whatever answer waited for that question, she suspected it was far more complicated than anything her simple life in the forest had prepared her for. The afternoon passed slowly, marked by the steady rhythm of tending her small fire and checking on her unexpected guest. Cale woke briefly around midday, just long enough for her to help him drink some water and swallow a few spoonfuls of broth before exhaustion pulled him back under. He barely spoke during this brief waking period, though his eyes tracked her movements around the small camp with an attentiveness that suggested his mind remained sharp despite his body's weakness. By evening, his fever had begun to rise, exactly the complication Lyra had feared might come from wounds left untreated for too long before she found him. She worked through the night applying cool water to his forehead, changing bandages that continued to seep despite her best efforts, whispering reassurances that she was not entirely sure he could hear in his current state. "Come on," she murmured, dabbing at the sweat beading along his brow. "You survived a river in the middle of a storm. You're not allowed to let a fever take you down after that." Whether he heard her words or not, something seemed to respond to them, his breathing evening out slightly, the tension in his features easing just enough to offer her a small measure of hope. She stayed awake through most of the night, dozing only briefly in short stretches, unwilling to let her guard down completely, with so much uncertainty hanging over both their situations. As dawn approached once again, marking a full day and night since she had pulled him from the river, Cale's fever finally began to break. Lyra noticed the change in his breathing first, then the way his skin no longer burned quite so hot beneath her hand, and felt a wave of relief wash over her so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She had not realized, until that moment, just how invested she had become in this stranger's survival, how much she had silently willed him to make it through the worst of his injuries. It surprised her, this depth of concern for someone she had known less than 2 full days, but she did not have the energy left to examine the feeling too closely. Instead, she simply allowed herself a small smile as she watched him sleep peacefully, for the first time since she had found him, his color returning to something closer to healthy, his breathing steady and calm. Whatever storm had brought him crashing into her carefully rebuilt life, whatever danger might still be following him, Lyra found herself grateful, in this quiet moment, that she had listened to that instinct telling her to run toward the river, instead of staying safely hidden in her shelter. Some decisions, she was beginning to understand, mattered more than personal safety, and pulling this stranger from the water, whoever he turned out to be, felt like exactly the kind of decision she would never regret making. 3 days passed before Cale's strength returned enough for him to sit upright without assistance, and by then, something had quietly shifted between the two of them, something Lyra could not quite name but felt with every passing hour. She had grown accustomed to his presence in her small camp faster than she expected, the space that had once felt so solitary, now filled with the sound of another person's breathing, another set of footsteps around the fire, another voice breaking the silence she had lived with for so many weeks. It should have felt like an intrusion. Instead, it felt strangely like company she had not realized she was missing. Cale, for his part, seemed to be studying her just as carefully as she found herself studying him. He watched the way she moved through her daily tasks with practiced efficiency, checking snares, gathering water, tending the fire, and she caught him more than once with an expression on his face that looked almost like admiration, though he quickly masked it whenever she noticed. "You built all of this yourself," he said one afternoon, gesturing around the small camp with the arm that had healed enough to move more freely. "The shelter, the storage, all of it." "I didn't have much choice," Lyra replied, not looking up from the fish she was cleaning for their evening meal. "It was either learn quickly or not survive at all." "How long have you been out here alone?" She paused, considering how much to share. There was something about Cale's steady, patient way of listening that made her want to talk, a rare feeling after weeks of forced silence and self-reliance. "A few months now," she said finally. "Since autumn started, really. Alone the whole time? No pack nearby?" "No pack," she confirmed, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I prefer it that way." Cale did not press further, though she could tell from the slight furrow of his brow that he wanted to. She appreciated the restraint, the way he seemed to sense the boundaries of what she was willing to discuss, and respected them, without demanding more than she offered freely. "What about you?" she asked, turning the question back on him, curious despite herself about the mystery he still represented. "You never told me how you ended up half drowned in my river." His expression shifted, something guarded settling over his features that reminded her, briefly, of how she must have looked in those first days after her rejection, when trust felt like a luxury she could not afford. "It's complicated," he said finally. "There are people who wanted me dead. I was running. The storm caught me before I could find safe ground." "People," she repeated, "not animals. People did that to you?" "Yes." She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what kind of enemies inflicted wounds that deep, what kind of conflict left a man of his obvious strength fleeing for his life through unfamiliar territory. But she recognized the same reluctance in his voice that she carried in her own chest, and she found she could not bring herself to push him toward memories that clearly still caused him pain. "Well," she said instead, offering him a small, reassuring smile, "whoever they are, they're not here now. You're safe, at least for as long as you need to heal." Something in his expression softened at her words, gratitude mixing with an emotion she could not quite identify. "You keep saying that. Safe. As though it's simple." "It's not simple," she admitted. "Nothing about safety is simple, not really. But I can promise you this particular corner of the forest, at least for now." They fell into an easy rhythm over the following days, one that surprised Lyra with how quickly it developed, despite the short time they had known each other. She continued her daily routine of gathering food and maintaining the camp, and as Cale's strength returned, he began finding small ways to help, insisting on contributing despite her protests that he should focus entirely on recovery. "I'm not the type to sit idle while someone else does all the work," he told her firmly, the first time she tried to stop him from helping gather firewood, his tone leaving no room for argument, despite the way he still winced slightly when he bent to pick up fallen branches. She found herself smiling more often than she had in months, small, genuine smiles that surprised her each time they appeared, brought on by some dry comment Cale made, or the quiet satisfaction of working alongside someone else, after so long doing everything entirely on her own. In the evenings, once their small meal was finished and the fire crackled steadily between them, they talked. Never about the details Cale refused to share, never about the specifics of Lyra's rejection that still felt too raw to fully voice, but about smaller things, safer things. She told him about the plants she had learned to identify, which berries were safe, and which would make a person violently ill. He told her, carefully, about growing up with responsibilities that felt heavier than he had wanted at the time, about learning to make difficult decisions before he felt ready for them. "Sounds like you had a hard childhood," she observed one evening, watching the way firelight played across his features. "Different kind of hard than most," he said. "I had everything I needed materially, but there was always pressure, always expectations I wasn't sure I could live up to." "What kind of expectations?" He hesitated, and she saw the familiar guardedness return to his eyes before he answered. "The kind that come with responsibility for a lot of people, being trusted to make decisions that affect more than just yourself." She did not press for specifics, sensing again that he was skirting close to the truth of his identity, without fully revealing it. But she found herself curious, in a way that went beyond simple practical concern, about who she was harboring in her camp. There was something magnetic about the way he spoke, the careful weight he gave to each word, the sense that every choice he made carried consequences he took seriously. "That sounds lonely," she said finally, and watched surprise flicker across his face at her observation. "It can be," he admitted. "Most people around me want something from me, or fear disappointing me, or simply see the position rather than the person. It's rare to find someone who just talks to me like this." Something in his voice, quiet and genuine, made Lyra's chest tighten with an emotion she did not fully understand. "I know what that's like," she said softly. "Being seen for what you can offer, instead of who you actually are." Their eyes met across the fire, and for a long moment, neither of them looked away. Lyra felt something pass between them in that silence, an understanding that went deeper than the words they had actually spoken, a recognition of shared loneliness that neither of them had expected to find in a stranger. "Thank you," Cale said finally, breaking the silence, "for treating me like a person rather than whatever title or position you might imagine I hold. You don't even know my full story, and yet you've shown me more genuine kindness than most people have in years." Lyra felt heat rise to her cheeks at his words, unused to receiving such direct appreciation, after so long being treated as insufficient by nearly everyone in her life. Anyone would have done the same, she said, though she knew, even as she spoke the words, that they were not entirely true. Not everyone would have risked the river current for a stranger. Not everyone would have shared their limited food supplies without hesitation. "No," Cale said, his voice firm. "Not everyone would have. I've learned that lesson the hard way, more than once." The conversation drifted after that, moving toward lighter topics. But the moment lingered in Lyra's mind, long after they had both settled in for the night. Her side of the small shelter, and his, separated by a respectful distance, that nonetheless felt smaller with each passing day. She found herself, over the following week, paying closer attention to details she should not have noticed. The way Cale's laugh, still rare but growing more frequent, transformed his entire face. The careful, deliberate way he moved, even now, as though every action had been considered before it was taken. The genuine curiosity he showed about her life, her thoughts, her opinions, treating her words with a weight and respect she had rarely experienced from anyone, let alone someone who so clearly carried significant authority in whatever life he had left behind. She told herself these observations meant nothing beyond simple appreciation for good company after months of isolation. She told herself the warmth that spread through her chest whenever he smiled at her was nothing more than gratitude, that her rescue had succeeded, that he had survived, and was healing well. But late at night, lying awake and listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing on the other side of the shelter, she began to suspect these explanations were not entirely honest, even to herself. Cale's recovery continued steadily through the following days, his wounds closing cleanly under her careful treatment, his strength returning enough that he began taking short walks around the perimeter of the camp, testing muscles that had been forced into stillness during the worst of his injuries. "You have a gift for healing," he told her one morning, examining the scar forming along his ribs, where the deepest of his wounds had been. "These should have taken much longer to close properly, especially without proper medical supplies." "I had good teachers," she said, though the admission carried a small edge of bitterness she could not fully hide. "Watching how the pack healers worked, even if they never taught me directly, taught me more than they probably intended." "They didn't teach you directly." "Why not?" Lyra hesitated, unsure how much to share, but something about the openness that had grown between them over the past week made her want to finally voice the truth she had been carrying since her rejection. "Omegas aren't usually considered worth investing training in," she said quietly. "We're expected to serve, not to develop skills that might make us valuable in our own right." Cale's expression darkened at her words, a flash of anger crossing his features that surprised her with its intensity. "That's absurd," he said firmly. "Skill and worth have nothing to do with rank. I've seen Omegas outperform Alphas in situations that mattered far more than pack politics. Try telling that to the pack I grew up in," Lyra said, unable to keep the old hurt entirely from her voice. "What happened?" Cale asked, his tone gentle now, an invitation rather than a demand. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready. But I'd like to understand, if you're willing to share." Lyra considered his offer for a long moment, weighing the familiar instinct to protect herself from further judgment against the growing trust she had developed for this man, who had shown her nothing but respect and gratitude since she pulled him from the river. Finally, she found herself speaking, the words coming slowly at first, before gaining momentum as the story poured out of her. She told him about Daniel, about the years she had spent trying to prove her worth to a mate who ultimately decided she offered nothing of value. She told him about the public rejection, standing in the rain while the entire pack watched and did nothing to intervene. She told him about walking away with nothing but the clothes on her back and a stubborn refusal to let the experience destroy her entirely. Cale listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail she shared, though his anger seemed directed entirely at the people who had hurt her, rather than at her for the vulnerability of sharing such a painful story. He was a fool, Cale said quietly once she finished, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised her with its intensity. Any pack that would treat someone with your strength and resourcefulness as worthless has lost something far more valuable than they realize. You don't have to say that just to make me feel better, Lyra said, though something in his tone suggested he meant every word. I'm not saying it to make you feel better, Cale replied. I'm saying it because it's true. I've watched you these past days, Lyra. You built an entire life from nothing, after being cast aside with cruelty I can barely imagine. You pulled a stranger from a raging river without hesitation, then nursed him back to health with skills you taught yourself out of necessity. That is not the profile of someone who offers nothing of value. That is the profile of someone remarkable. Lyra felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, at the sincerity in his words. No one had spoken to her this way since before her rejection, and even then, she was not sure anyone had truly seen her the way Cale seemed to see her now. Thank you, she whispered, unable to trust her voice with more than those two simple words. Cale reached out, his hand covering hers, where it rested on the ground between them, warm and steady. You deserve far better than what that pack gave you, he said. I hope, someday, you find people who recognize your worth, the way you deserve to be recognized. Neither of them moved away from the contact, and Lyra found herself acutely aware of the warmth of his hand against hers, of the way her heart had begun beating faster, in a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear or exertion. Something was building between them, something she had not expected and was not entirely sure how to navigate, but in that quiet moment beside the fire, she found she did not want to pull away. Whatever storm had carried Cale into her life, she was beginning to suspect it had brought something far more significant than a stranger to nurse back to health. And though uncertainty about his true identity still lingered in the back of her mind, for now, she allowed herself simply to enjoy the warmth of connection she had not realized how deeply she missed. A distant howl cut through the quiet morning air, and Lyra's entire body went rigid, her hand freezing halfway through braiding a length of cord she had been weaving from dried grass. Cale noticed her sudden stillness immediately, his own posture shifting into something alert and watchful, a stark contrast to the relaxed recovery he had been enjoying over the past several days. What is it? He asked quietly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. That howl, Lyra said, straining to listen for any repetition of the sound. It wasn't natural, it was a signal. Cale's expression darkened, and he rose to his feet despite the way his healing wounds clearly protested the sudden movement. How far away? Hard to say, a mile, maybe more. Lyra stood as well, her earlier peaceful morning, now replaced with the same cautious tension that had governed her first weeks alone in the forest. It could be nothing. Rogue wolves sometimes use calls like that to communicate across territory. Or it could be someone looking for me, Cale said grimly, and the way his jaw tightened told her he considered this the more likely explanation. They stood in silence for several long minutes, listening for any further sound, but the forest remained quiet, except for the ordinary rustling of wind, through leaves, and the distant call of birds settling into their morning routines. Eventually, Lyra allowed herself to relax slightly, though the unease did not fully leave her. We should be careful for the next few days, she said, just in case. Cale nodded, though she noticed the way his gaze remained fixed on the tree line, scanning for any sign of movement that might indicate danger approaching. I don't want to bring trouble to your doorstep, he said. You've already given me more than I could ever repay. If my enemies find me here, it puts you at risk too. I made my choice when I pulled you out of that river, Lyra said firmly. I'm not going to abandon you now, just because there might be some danger involved. You should consider it though, Cale said, turning to face her fully, his expression serious. Whoever did this to me, they won't hesitate to hurt anyone standing between them and their target. If they find me here, they will see you as an obstacle, nothing more. Lyra felt a flash of stubborn defiance rise in her chest, the same resolve that had carried her through months of solitary survival. I've survived rejection, isolation, and every hardship this forest could throw at me. she said. I'm not running from a threat that hasn't even shown itself yet. Something in Cale's expression shifted, admiration mixing with what looked almost like worry as he studied her face. You truly aren't afraid, are you? I'm afraid, Lyra admitted. But fear has never stopped me from doing what I believe is right. And helping you heal, keeping you safe until you're strong enough to face whatever is coming, that feels like the right thing to do. Cale was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was choosing his words with great care. You are unlike anyone I have ever known, Lyra. Most people in my life calculate every decision based on what they might gain or lose. You simply act according to what you believe is right, regardless of the risk to yourself. Maybe that's foolish, she said, offering a small, self-deprecating smile. No, Cale said firmly. It's rare. And it's precisely why I trust you more than almost anyone I've known in years. The weight of his words settled between them, and Lyra found herself once again struck by the strange intimacy that had grown so quickly in the days since she pulled him from the river. She had spent so long guarding herself against the possibility of connection, convinced that trusting anyone again would only lead to more pain. But something about Cale made those careful walls feel less necessary, less like protection, and more like a prison she had built for herself out of old wounds. Over the following days, they fell into a routine that balanced caution with the growing warmth between them. Cale, though still healing, insisted on taking a more active role in maintaining vigilance around the camp, teaching Lyra techniques for identifying potential threats that went beyond anything she had learned during her solitary months in the wilderness. Watch the birds, he told her one afternoon, as they sat near the edge of the camp, his sharp eyes scanning the canopy above them. If they suddenly go quiet or scatter, something has disturbed them. That's often the first warning you'll get before you see or hear a threat yourself. You know a lot about tracking and defense, Lyra observed, watching him with curiosity. Necessity, he said simply, though something in his tone suggested there was far more to the story than he was willing to share. She had grown used to these small evasions, the careful way he skirted around specifics of his past life, and she no longer pushed for details he was not ready to offer. It was enough, for now, to know that he trusted her with as much as he could safely share, and that the trust between them continued to deepen with each passing day, despite the mystery that still surrounded his true identity. In turn, she taught him what she knew of the forest, the safest paths through the underbrush, which plants offered medicine, and which offered poison, the best techniques for catching fish in the swollen autumn streams. He proved a quick student, absorbing her lessons with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything, and she found herself taking quiet pride in watching him master skills that had taken her weeks of trial and painful error to learn on her own. You're a good teacher, he told her one evening, examining the simple snare he had just successfully set with her guidance. Patient, thorough. You'd make an excellent trainer for new pack members, if you ever found a pack willing to recognize that. The comment, meant as a compliment, still carried an edge of old pain for Lyra, a reminder of exactly the kind of dismissal she had experienced from the only pack she had ever known. I don't think I'll be looking for a new pack anytime soon, she said, keeping her voice carefully light, despite the complicated feelings the topic stirred. Cale studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression. Not even if you found one that valued you the way you deserve? Those don't exist, she said, though even as she spoke the words, some small part of her wondered if she truly believed them anymore. Not after everything she had witnessed in Cale's treatment of her over the past weeks. They do, Cale said quietly. I promise you, they do. Something in his certainty made her look at him more closely, searching his expression for whatever conviction lay behind those words. But before she could ask him to elaborate, a sound in the distance caught both their attention, the same kind of distant howl that had unsettled them days earlier, though this time closer, more distinct. Cale's entire posture shifted immediately, tension coiling through his frame as he rose to his feet, scanning the tree line with an intensity that told Lyra exactly how seriously he took this new development. That's closer than before, he said grimly. Much closer. What do we do? Lyra asked, her own instincts sharpening in response to his obvious concern. We need to be ready to move, if necessary, Cale said. I won't let whoever is searching for me find you unprepared. They spent the rest of the day in heightened alertness, Lyra quietly gathering essential supplies into a bundle she could carry quickly if the need to flee arose, while Cale positioned himself at various vantage points around the camp, watching for any sign of approach. The howls continued sporadically throughout the afternoon, never close enough to indicate immediate danger, but persistent enough to keep both of them on edge. As evening approached, and the howls finally faded into silence, Cale allowed himself to relax slightly, though the tension never fully left his shoulders. "They're searching a wide area," he said, more to himself than to Lyra. "That suggests they haven't narrowed down my exact location yet. We might have more time than I initially feared." "Time for what?" Lyra asked. Cale turned to look at her, something complicated crossing his features. "Time for me to figure out how to protect you, if it comes to that. And time, perhaps, to figure out what exactly this connection between us means, before circumstances force decisions neither of us feels ready to make." His words hung heavy in the evening air between them, and Lyra felt her heart quicken at the implication behind them. Whatever was building between herself and this mysterious stranger she had pulled from the river, it had grown into something neither of them could easily deny anymore, even as the looming threat of his unknown enemies cast a shadow over whatever future they might have hoped to explore. "Cale," she said softly, "whoever is looking for you, whoever hurt you like this, are they going to find you eventually? Is there any way to stop them?" His expression grew somber, old weight settling back into his features that had softened so much during his time in her care. "Eventually, yes," he admitted. "I can't hide forever. There are responsibilities waiting for me, people depending on me, that I cannot abandon indefinitely, no matter how much peace I've found here with you." The admission struck Lyra with unexpected force, a reminder that whatever this strange, beautiful interlude had become, it existed within limited time, that Cale's true life waited for him somewhere beyond the borders of her small forest camp, a life that would eventually pull him away from her, regardless of whatever connection had grown between them. "When you go back," she asked carefully, "what happens to us? To this?" Cale reached for her hand, his grip warm and steady, despite the uncertainty clouding his expression. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "But I know. I don't want to simply walk away and pretend none of this mattered. You saved my life, Lyra. You've shown me more genuine kindness and connection in these past weeks than I've experienced in years. Whatever happens when I return to my responsibilities, I refuse to let that be the end of whatever this is between us." His words offered little concrete comfort against the uncertainty of what waited beyond her small camp, but the sincerity behind them settled something anxious in her chest nonetheless. Whatever storm had brought Cale crashing into her carefully rebuilt life, and whatever storm might eventually carry him away again, Lyra found herself grateful, despite the fear and uncertainty, that she had chosen to run toward the river that night, instead of staying safely hidden away. Some connections, she was beginning to understand, were worth the risk of pain that might follow, worth the uncertainty of not knowing how the story would end. And as she sat there beside Cale in the fading evening light, his hand still holding hers, she allowed herself, for the first time since her rejection, to hope that perhaps her story was not finished being written after all. Days turned into a second week, and though the distant howls never fully disappeared, they grew less frequent, less alarming, until both Lyra and Cale settled back into something resembling the peaceful rhythm they had built before that first warning call disrupted their quiet routine. Cale's wounds had healed remarkably well by now, the deep gashes reduced to thin, pale scars that marked his skin as the only visible reminder of the night she had pulled him from the churning river. His strength had fully returned as well, evident in the ease with which he moved now, no longer favoring his injured side, no longer wincing at sudden movements that would have caused him pain just weeks earlier. With his physical recovery complete, Lyra found herself increasingly aware that his time in her small camp was drawing to a natural close, that soon he would need to face whatever waited for him beyond the boundaries of her forest, whatever responsibilities and dangers he had been so carefully avoiding discussing. She tried not to dwell on the approaching end of their strange, unexpected companionship, but the awareness colored every interaction between them now, lending a bittersweet quality to moments that might otherwise have felt simply pleasant. "You're getting stronger every day," she observed one morning, watching him effortlessly split firewood with an axe he had fashioned from materials found around the camp, his movements sure and powerful, in a way that reminded her, uncomfortably, of exactly how capable and significant he must be, in whatever life waited for him elsewhere. "Thanks to you," he said, setting down the axe and turning to face her, his expression softening in the way it always did when his attention shifted fully toward her. "I don't think I properly understand yet how much I owe you, Lyra. Not just for pulling me from the river, but for everything since. The care, the patience, the way you've treated me as simply a person rather than whatever titles or expectations follow me elsewhere. You don't owe me anything," she said, though warmth spread through her chest at his words regardless. "I told you before, I couldn't have just left you to drown." "Even so," Cale said, closing the distance between them, until he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. "What you've given me these past weeks, the safety, the companionship, the honesty, that's not something easily repaid. I want you to know that whatever happens next, whatever I return to, I will not forget this. I will not forget you." The intensity in his voice, the sincerity behind his words, made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. She had spent so long guarding herself against exactly this kind of vulnerability, convinced after Daniel's rejection that opening herself to genuine connection again would only invite more pain. But standing here now, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from Cale's body, close enough to see the careful tenderness in his expression, she found she could not maintain those old defenses any longer. "Cale," she started, unsure exactly what she meant to say, only certain that the moment demanded honesty she had been avoiding for days. "I know," he said softly, reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair back from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I feel it too. Whatever this is between us, it's real, isn't it? Not just gratitude, not just the strange intimacy of shared survival, something more." "Something more," she agreed quietly, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it. Neither of them moved for a long moment, simply standing close together in the quiet morning light, the space between them charged with everything they had both been carefully avoiding voicing aloud. Then Cale leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she chose, and when she did not, when she instead leaned toward him, he closed the remaining distance and kissed her. It was gentle at first, careful, as though he feared she might change her mind, but when she responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, the kiss deepened into something that carried all the weeks of growing connection, all the careful trust they had built between two people who had both been taught, in different ways, that vulnerability invited pain. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Cale rested his forehead against hers, his hands cradling her face with a tenderness that made her chest ache with an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel in far too long. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to reconcile the life waiting for me with whatever this is that we've found here, but I know I don't want to lose you, Lyra. Whatever complications come with the truth of who I am, I don't want this to be the end of us." "The truth of who you are," she repeated, pulling back slightly to study his face. "You still haven't told me." "Not really." Cale's expression grew serious, and she saw him wrestling with some internal decision, weighing whatever risk came with finally sharing the details he had guarded so carefully since the night she found him. "I will," he said finally. "I promise you. I will tell you everything. But I need you to understand first that whatever I share, it doesn't change who I've been with you these past weeks. That person, the one who healed under your care, who found peace and honesty and genuine connection with you. That's who I truly am, more than any title or responsibility that comes with the rest of my life." His words carried an ominous weight that made Lyra's stomach tighten with sudden uncertainty. "Cale, what aren't you telling me?" Before he could answer, a new sound cut through the morning air, closer and more urgent than any of the distant howls they had heard over the previous days. This time, it was not a single call but multiple voices, wolves communicating in coordinated patterns that suggested organized movement rather than random searching. Cale's entire body went rigid, his expression shifting instantly from vulnerable openness to sharp, alert focus. "They found the general area," he said grimly. "That's a search pattern, not random calling. They're closing in." "What do we do?" Lyra asked, her earlier romantic tension replaced immediately with the same practical urgency that had governed their previous days of caution. "I need you to stay hidden," Cale said, already moving toward the edge of the camp, positioning himself protectively between Lyra and the direction the calls seemed to be coming from. If these are my people, they'll recognize me and stand down immediately. But if they're the ones who attacked me originally, I need to be ready to protect you. I'm not hiding while you face danger alone, Lyra said firmly, moving to stand beside him rather than retreating as he had suggested. Lyra, please, Cale said, turning to face her with obvious desperation in his expression. I have already put you in enough danger simply by being here. I cannot bear the thought of you being hurt because of enemies that have nothing to do with you. And I cannot bear the thought of hiding while someone I care about faces danger alone, she countered, her jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had carried her through every hardship of her solitary survival. The sound of approaching movement grew louder, branches snapping, multiple sets of paws moving with purpose through the underbrush toward their small camp. Cale positioned himself fully in front of Lyra now, his stance shifting into something ready and defensive, every muscle coiled with tension, as he prepared to face whatever emerged from the tree line. Whatever happens, he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching threat, know that these past weeks with you have meant more to me than I can properly express. Whoever I am, beyond this forest, whatever responsibilities and dangers wait for me, none of that changes what I feel for you. Lyra's heart pounded with fear, and something else entirely, a fierce protective instinct that surprised her with its intensity as she readied herself to stand beside Cale against whatever threat approached. Whatever danger had followed him to her doorstep, whatever truth he had been building toward revealing before they were interrupted, she found she was not willing to simply step aside and let him face it alone. The underbrush at the edge of the camp rustled violently, and multiple large wolves emerged into the clearing, their eyes immediately locking onto Cale's position. For a moment, tense silence stretched between the newcomers and the two figures standing ready to defend themselves, neither side making the first move. Then, to Lyra's complete astonishment, the largest of the wolves dropped immediately into a posture of deep submission, lowering himself to the ground, before Cale, in a gesture of respect so profound, it left her utterly confused about what she was witnessing. Your Majesty, the wolf said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing as he began to shift, human form emerging where Wolf had stood moments before, revealing a battle-hardened warrior kneeling in the mud, his head bowed low. We have searched for you for weeks. Thank the moon goddess, you're alive. The other wolves that had accompanied him followed suit immediately, shifting and kneeling in the same posture of absolute deference, and Lyra felt the ground shift beneath her feet, in a way that had nothing to do with the physical earth, and everything to do with the sudden, overwhelming realization crashing over her. Your Majesty. She turned slowly to look at Cale, whose expression had shifted into something guarded and apprehensive, clearly bracing himself for whatever reaction was about to come from her upon this revelation he had been trying, and failing, to share before the search party arrived. Cale, she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, what exactly is happening right now? Who are these people, and why are they calling you Majesty? The silence that followed Lyra's question stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The kneeling warriors still bowed low before them, waiting for their leader to respond, while Lyra stood frozen, waiting for an explanation that would somehow make sense of the scene unfolding in front of her. Finally, Cale turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a weight of apology that made her stomach twist with growing unease. Lyra, he said quietly, I should have told you sooner. I wanted to, more times than you know, but I was afraid of exactly what is happening right now. The way everything changes the moment you learn the truth. What truth? She asked, though some part of her had already begun piecing together the answer from the evidence in front of her. The deference of the warriors, the title they had used, the undeniable authority that had always seemed to radiate from Cale, even in his most vulnerable moments. My name is Cale Ashgrove, he said, his voice steady, despite the visible tension in his shoulders. I am the Alpha King of the Cade Territories, ruler of the largest pack alliance in this entire region. The wounds you found me with, they came from an assassination attempt by rival factions, seeking to seize control, while I traveled without my usual guard. The words landed like a physical blow, and Lyra found herself taking an involuntary step backward, her mind racing to reconcile the man who had shared her small camp, who had helped her gather firewood and taught her defensive techniques, who had kissed her just moments before this revelation, with the powerful ruler now standing before her with warriors kneeling in absolute submission at his feet. "You're the Alpha King," she repeated numbly, "the most powerful ruler in the entire region, and I've been treating you like just a regular person this whole time." "You treated me like a person, because that's exactly what I needed," Kale said, taking a step toward her, his expression earnest and pleading. "Lyra, please understand, everything that happened between us these past weeks, none of it was diminished by the fact that I hadn't told you my full title. If anything, it was more real, because you cared for me without knowing, without any expectation of reward or advantage that might come from helping a king." The kneeling warrior who had first addressed Kale rose slightly, his expression shifting to something curious as he studied Lyra more closely. "This is the Omega who saved you, Your Majesty? The one whose signature you asked us to track when we first arrived?" Kale's jaw tightened slightly at the warrior's words, though he nodded in confirmation. "Yes, this is Lyra. Without her, I would not have survived that night in the river. I owe her my life." The warrior's expression shifted immediately, and he bowed his head toward Lyra with the same deep respect he had shown Kale moments earlier. "Then the entire kingdom owes you a debt that cannot easily be repaid," he said solemnly. "Thank you for saving our king." Lyra felt overwhelmed by the sudden shift in how she was being perceived, from an ordinary Omega surviving alone in the forest, to someone apparently deserving of formal gratitude from armed warriors who had traveled for weeks, searching for their missing ruler. The dizzying change left her struggling to find solid ground amid so much unexpected information. "I need a moment," she said quietly, backing away from the gathered group, her mind still reeling from everything she had just learned. Kale immediately moved to follow her, waving off his warriors with a gesture that clearly communicated they should give them space. "Lyra, please, let me explain." "Explain what exactly?" she asked, turning to face him once they had put some distance between themselves and the warriors, her voice carrying an edge of hurt that she could not entirely suppress. "That you let me believe you were just an ordinary wolf running from danger, when really you're the most powerful alpha in the entire region. That every moment we shared, every conversation, every small confession, it was all happening while you concealed something this significant about yourself." "I wasn't trying to deceive you," Kale said, his voice earnest. "I was trying to protect myself, and honestly, trying to hold on to something rare and genuine, before the truth of my position inevitably changed everything. You have no idea how often people treat me differently the moment they learn my title, how quickly genuine connection gets replaced with calculation and ambition. And you thought I would be the same," Lyra said, understanding dawning even through her hurt. "You thought I would treat you differently if I knew." "I didn't know what to think," Kale admitted, "but I knew that what we had, the honesty, the ease of connection, felt too precious to risk losing before I was ready. I was going to tell you, Lyra. This morning, before my warriors arrived, I was building toward exactly that conversation. I just didn't get the chance to finish it on my own terms." Lyra wrapped her arms around herself, trying to process the enormity of what had just been revealed, the way it recontextualized every interaction they had shared over the past weeks. The man who had helped her gather firewood, who had learned to set snares under her guidance, who had shared quiet, vulnerable conversations by their small fire, all of that had been the Alpha King of the largest pack alliance in the region, hiding his true identity for reasons she was only beginning to understand. "Does this change anything?" Kale asked quietly, watching her with obvious anxiety. "What we found together, does knowing the truth about my position change how you feel?" Lyra considered the question seriously, searching her own heart for an honest answer, beneath the shock still coursing through her system. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I need time to understand what this means, Kale. Not just for whatever we've built together, but for practical reality. You're a king. I'm a rejected Omega, with nothing to my name. Those are not equal positions, no matter what genuine connection we might have found here. Status has never mattered to me, the way it seems to matter to everyone else," Kale said firmly. "Not when it comes to genuine worth, genuine character. You've shown me more of both than anyone I've encountered in years of ruling." "That's easy to say," Lyra replied, old insecurities resurfacing despite her best efforts to push them aside. "But your kingdom, your people, they'll have expectations about who deserves to stand beside their king." A rejected Omega with no pack, no status, no claim to anything beyond what she's built alone in a forest. That's not exactly the kind of match anyone would expect for someone in your position. Kale reached for her hands, holding them gently, despite her initial hesitation to accept the contact. I don't care what anyone expects, he said firmly. I care about what's true, about who genuinely deserves respect and partnership based on their actions and character, rather than arbitrary status. You saved my life, without knowing who I was, or what reward might come from it. That tells me everything I need to know about your true worth, regardless of what title you carry or don't carry. His words offered some comfort against the storm of uncertainty swirling through her mind, but the practical reality of the situation still weighed heavily. Whatever genuine connection they had built, however sincere Kale's feelings appeared to be, the world beyond her small forest camp operated according to rules and expectations that had already once taught her, brutally, exactly how little her worth counted for in the eyes of pack hierarchy and status. What happens now? She asked finally, forcing herself to focus on practical matters rather than the emotional turmoil still churning inside her. Now, Kale said, I need to return to my kingdom. There is important business waiting, security matters that require my immediate attention given the attempt on my life. But I don't want this to be goodbye, Lyra. I want you to come with me, at least to see the kingdom, to understand more fully who I am and what my life actually looks like beyond this forest. The invitation caught her off guard, and she found herself hesitating, torn between the pull of curiosity and connection that had grown so strong between them, and the fear of stepping into a world where her status as a rejected Omega might once again mark her as insufficient, unworthy, an outsider who did not belong. I don't know if I'm ready for that, she admitted honestly. You don't have to decide right now, Kale said gently. But please, at least consider it. Whatever fears you carry about status and belonging, I promise you, in my kingdom, those fears will not determine how you're treated. I will make certain of that personally. Lyra studied his face, searching for any hint of the deception she had feared upon first learning his true identity, but found only sincerity and quiet hope reflected in his dark eyes. Whatever complications this revelation had introduced into their still new connection, the genuine care behind his words remained undeniable. I'll think about it, she said finally, and watched relief soften his tense expression at even this small concession. That's all I ask, Kale said. Take whatever time you need, but please know, Lyra, whatever you decide, I meant everything I said before my warriors interrupted us. What we found together here, it was real. It still is real, and I intend to prove that to you, regardless of what obstacles or doubts stand between us. As the warriors waited respectfully at the edge of the clearing, giving their king the space he needed for this private conversation, Lyra found herself facing a decision that would once again reshape the entire trajectory of her life, just as her rejection had months earlier. Except this time, instead of being cast out with nothing, she was being offered an invitation into a world of power and status that both intrigued and terrified her in equal measure. Whatever she chose, she understood clearly that her quiet, solitary life in this forest camp, the careful peace she had built from nothing, was about to change dramatically, regardless of the outcome. The only question remaining was whether she was brave enough to step into that uncertain future alongside the man who had, against every expectation, become someone she genuinely cared for, king or not. 3 days after the warriors arrived, Lyra stood at the edge of her small camp for what she suspected might be the last time, taking in every detail of the place that had become her sanctuary during the hardest months of her life. She had made her decision slowly, carefully, weighing every fear against the genuine connection she could not deny had grown between herself and Kale. In the end, it was not the promise of status or luxury that convinced her, but a simple truth she kept returning to during long nights of consideration. Kale had shown her more genuine respect and care in a few weeks than her entire former pack had shown her in years. Whatever uncertainty waited in his kingdom, staying hidden away in the forest out of fear, felt like exactly the kind of small, cautious existence she had promised herself she would not settle for after her rejection. "Are you ready?" Kale asked, appearing beside her, with the easy grace that seemed even more pronounced now that she understood the authority that came naturally to him. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said, though nervousness still fluttered in her stomach at the thought of stepping into a world so far beyond anything she had experienced. The journey to the Cade territories took the better part of 2 days, traveling first on foot through the deeper forest, then along established roads once they crossed into more populated regions, with Kael's warriors maintaining careful watch throughout the entire trip. Lyra found herself increasingly aware of the differences between the world she was entering and the simple, quiet life she had built for herself. The way villages grew more elaborate the closer they traveled to the kingdom's central territory. The way people they passed offered deep bows of respect the moment they recognized their king. By the time they reached the grand gates of the Cade territory's central stronghold, Lyra felt entirely overwhelmed by the scale of everything around her. Stone walls rising higher than any structure she had ever seen, guards positioned with military precision along every visible entry point, and beyond the walls, a sprawling territory that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. "This is all yours?" she asked quietly, unable to fully process the scope of what Kael actually ruled. "This is my responsibility," he corrected gently. "Every person within these walls, every pack under my protection, they depend on decisions I make. It's less about ownership and more about the weight of ensuring their safety and prosperity." The distinction struck her as meaningful, another small piece of evidence about the kind of ruler Kael actually was, someone who viewed his position through the lens of duty and care, rather than simple power and possession. Their arrival at the central stronghold drew immediate attention, servants and advisors rushing forward with obvious relief at their king's safe return, questions and reports flooding toward Kael from every direction as he stepped through the gates. Lyra found herself standing slightly apart from the chaos, suddenly acutely aware of how out of place she appeared amid the polished formality of the royal court, her simple forest-made clothing standing in stark contrast to the elegant attire worn by everyone around her. "This way," Kael said, extending his hand toward her once the initial flurry of urgent business had been addressed, guiding her through the grand entrance hall, toward what she assumed were private quarters reserved for the royal family. "I know this is overwhelming. Please know, you have my complete protection here, regardless of whatever whispers or judgments you might encounter." The whispers came sooner than either of them expected. As they made their way through the stronghold's corridors, Lyra caught fragments of hushed conversation from courtiers and advisors, who clearly recognized her as someone unexpected accompanying their returned king, speculation about her identity and status rippling through the halls faster than Kael could control. "Who is she?" "An Omega, by the scent of her. No pack markings visible. Surely His Majesty hasn't brought some forest stray into the palace." The comments, though not spoken directly to her face, still landed with painful familiarity, echoes of exactly the kind of dismissal she had experienced back at her former pack. Old insecurities surged forward despite her best efforts to remain composed, and she found herself instinctively pulling slightly away from Kael's side, suddenly desperate to disappear from the scrutinizing attention focused on her. Kael noticed immediately, his expression darkening as he caught the tail end of one particularly cutting comment from a nearby advisor. He stopped walking, turning to address the gathered court with an authority that instantly silenced the room. "This is Lyra," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the grand hall, ensuring every present member of the court understood exactly who stood beside him. "She pulled me from a raging river when I was near death from the assassination attempt against my life. She nursed my wounds with her own hands, sheltered me with her own resources, and asked for absolutely nothing in return. Without her courage and skill, your king would not be standing before you today." The room fell into stunned silence at this declaration, the earlier whispers of judgment replaced immediately with expressions of shock and, in many cases, genuine respect. "She will be treated," Kael continued, his voice leaving no room for argument, "with the honor and gratitude befitting someone who saved the life of your king. Anyone who fails to show her appropriate respect answers directly to me." Lyra felt heat rise to her cheeks at the public declaration, overwhelmed by both the intensity of Kael's protective response and the sudden shift in how the assembled court now regarded her. Where moments earlier she had felt like an unwelcome intruder, judged and dismissed at first glance, now she found herself the object of genuine curiosity and, from many faces, sincere admiration. An older woman stepped forward from the gathered crowd, her expression carrying warmth that immediately put Lyra slightly more at ease amid the overwhelming formality surrounding her. "Forgive our surprise, dear," the woman said gently. "We simply did not expect His Majesty to return with company, after so many weeks of uncertainty about his fate. I am Ruth, head of the royal household. If you have need of anything during your stay, please do not hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Lyra said, grateful for the kindness, after the earlier sting of judgment. As the initial shock of Cale's dramatic declaration settled, and the court slowly returned to its usual rhythms, Cale guided Lyra toward private quarters that had been prepared for her, ensuring she had access to proper clothing, comfortable accommodations, and anything else she might need during her stay. "I'm sorry about their initial reaction," he said, once they were finally alone in the quiet of her assigned chambers. "I should have anticipated it and prepared you better." "It's all right," Lyra said, though the earlier discomfort still lingered somewhat in her chest. "I've faced worse judgment before. At least here, you stood up for me." "I will always stand up for you," Cale said firmly, his expression earnest. "Lyra, I meant everything I said back there. You saved my life. That fact alone earns you more honor in this kingdom than status or pack lineage ever could. But beyond that, what I feel for you, it has nothing to do with gratitude or debt. It's simply who you are, the character and courage you've shown me since that first night at the river." Lyra felt her earlier anxieties slowly easing under the sincerity of his words, though a lingering worry remained about how she would truly fit into this vast, unfamiliar world of power and formal expectation. "This is all so much," she admitted. "The kingdom, the court, everyone watching and judging. I don't know if I know how to exist in this world, Cale." "You don't have to figure it all out immediately," he said gently, taking her hands in his. "Take whatever time you need to adjust. I'm not asking you to become someone you're not, or to immediately take on responsibilities you're not ready for. I simply want you here, close to me, while we figure out together what this connection between us truly means." Over the following days, Lyra slowly began adjusting to the rhythms of palace life, though the transition remained challenging in ways both large and small. She found herself grateful for Ruth's patient guidance, the older woman taking it upon herself to help Lyra navigate the complicated social expectations of court life, without making her feel inadequate for not already understanding them. Cale, despite the demanding responsibilities of managing security concerns following the assassination attempt against him, made a point of spending time with her each day, whether sharing meals together, away from the formal scrutiny of the full court, or simply walking through the palace gardens in quiet conversation that reminded her of the easy connection they had built during their weeks together in the forest. "Does it get easier?" she asked him one evening, as they walked together through gardens illuminated by soft lantern light, the formal demands of the day finally behind them. "This feeling of not quite belonging?" "I think everyone who arrives somewhere new feels that way at first," Cale said thoughtfully. "But you're not simply arriving somewhere new, Lyra. You saved my life. That alone gives you a place here that no amount of pack lineage or formal status could match. Give it time. The court will come to see what I already see in you." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the whispers and judgment she had experienced upon first arrival would fade as the court grew more accustomed to her presence. But some deep, wounded part of her, the part still carrying scars from Daniel's public rejection, could not fully shake the fear that she would once again be found insufficient, that the gap between her humble origins and Cale's royal status would eventually prove too significant to overcome. That fear, unfortunately, was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have anticipated, as news began traveling through the kingdom's networks about the Omega who had saved the Alpha King's life, news that would eventually reach territories far beyond the Cade borders, including the one place Lyra had hoped never to think about again. Word travels fast between pack territories, faster still when the story involves something as remarkable as a Forest Omega saving the life of the most powerful Alpha King in the entire region, and it did not take long before that story reached the borders of the Ashwood Pack. Lyra had no way of knowing, as she settled into her third week within the Cade stronghold, gradually growing more comfortable with the rhythms of palace life, and the genuine warmth Cale continued to show her at every opportunity, that a familiar face was preparing to make the long journey to the Cade territories, driven by an entirely different set of motivations than concern for her well-being. She was in the palace gardens, practicing the formal greeting customs Ruth had been patiently teaching her over the past several days, when a palace guard approached with an expression that immediately told her something significant had occurred. "There is a visitor requesting an audience," the guard said. "He claims former connection to you, my lady. A beta from the Ashwood pack." Lyra felt her blood run cold at the words, her stomach twisting into a tight knot of dread, even before the guard finished speaking. "Daniel," she whispered, the name tasting bitter on her tongue after months of trying to forget the man who had once claimed to be her mate, before casting her aside with such casual cruelty. "Shall I inform His Majesty?" the guard asked. "Yes," Lyra said immediately, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please, find Cale right away." Within minutes, Cale arrived at the garden entrance, his expression already darkening with barely controlled anger, as he took in the news the guard had relayed to him on the way. "He's here? At my stronghold, requesting an audience with you?" "That's what the guard said," Lyra confirmed, her hands trembling slightly, despite her efforts to remain composed. "You don't have to see him," Cale said firmly. "I can have him turned away immediately, sent back to whatever territory he crawled out from, without ever setting eyes on you." Part of Lyra wanted exactly that, wanted to avoid the pain of confronting the man who had once made her feel so worthless, so easily discarded. But another part of her, the part that had survived months alone in the forest, that had grown stronger and more resilient through every hardship she overcame, felt a fierce need to face him directly, to show him exactly how far she had come since the night he stood on that platform and declared her unworthy in front of their entire pack. "No," she said finally, straightening her shoulders with resolve. "I want to see him. I want him to understand that his rejection didn't destroy me." Cale studied her expression for a long moment, before nodding slowly, though his jaw remained tight with obvious protective tension. "If that's what you want, then I will be right beside you. He does not get to speak to you alone, not after everything he put you through." They received Daniel in the formal audience chamber, Cale seated on his throne with an authority that filled the entire room, Lyra standing beside him rather than in any submissive position, a deliberate choice that Cale had insisted upon the moment they entered the space together. Daniel entered flanked by two attendants, his expression carrying the same arrogant confidence Lyra remembered from their years together, though she noticed, with something like grim satisfaction, that his eyes widened slightly with obvious surprise upon seeing her standing so prominently beside the Alpha King. "Lyra," Daniel said, his voice carrying a false warmth that immediately set her teeth on edge. "You look well. I heard the most remarkable story, about an Omega who saved the life of the great Alpha King himself. I could hardly believe it referred to you, but here you are." "What do you want, Daniel?" Lyra asked, keeping her voice steady, despite the old, familiar unease that his presence still stirred in her chest. "I came to see you, of course," Daniel said, taking a step forward, before Cale's low, warning growl stopped him immediately in his tracks. "To offer my congratulations on your remarkable fortune, and perhaps to discuss what this means for our situation." "Our situation," Lyra repeated flatly. "There is no our situation, Daniel. You rejected me. Publicly, cruelly, in front of the entire pack. That ended whatever connection we once had." "Circumstances have changed," Daniel said, his tone shifting to something more calculating now. "Grace and I have not been entirely happy together, if I'm honest. And given your new position, your value to the Pack Alliance system has clearly increased significantly. Perhaps we could discuss renewing our bond, given how much has changed." The audacity of his words left Lyra momentarily speechless, disbelief and anger warring for dominance in her chest, as she processed exactly what Daniel was proposing. He had rejected her when he believed her worthless, and now, upon learning she had somehow gained value in his eyes through her connection to Cale, he expected her to simply welcome him back with open arms. "You rejected me," she said slowly, each word carrying the weight of months of pain and rebuilding, "because you believed I brought nothing of value to our bond. Nothing has changed about who I am, Daniel. I am the same person I was that night you stood on that platform and humiliated me in front of everyone we knew. The only thing that's changed is your perception of my worth, based entirely on my proximity to power, rather than any genuine reassessment of my character." "Lyra, please," Daniel said, his tone growing more urgent as he sensed the conversation slipping away from whatever outcome he had hoped for. I made a mistake. I can admit that now. Give me a chance to make things right between us. Cale rose from his throne then, his presence filling the room with unmistakable authority as he stepped forward to stand directly beside Lyra, his expression carrying a cold fury that made even Daniel's attendants shift nervously. You had your chance, Cale said, his voice low and dangerous. You rejected her when she needed compassion and support, casting her out with nothing to fend for herself in dangerous, unclaimed territory. She survived that cruelty through her own strength and resourcefulness, not because of anything you offered her. And now you dare to come into my kingdom, believing you have any claim to renew a bond you so casually destroyed. Daniel's confidence finally began to waver under the weight of Cale's undeniable authority and obvious protective fury. Your Majesty, I meant no disrespect. I simply believed, given our history. Your history, Cale interrupted, consists of you publicly humiliating a person who deserved nothing but respect and support. Lyra saved my life through pure selfless courage, asking for nothing in return. She has shown more genuine character in the months since you cast her aside than you have demonstrated in this entire conversation. She owes you nothing, least of all a second chance to hurt her again. This is between Lyra and myself, Daniel said, some of his earlier arrogance returning despite the obvious danger of challenging the Alpha King directly. As her former mate, I still hold certain claims that— You hold no claims, Cale said, his voice cutting through Daniel's protest with absolute finality. A rejection, once spoken publicly and formally, cannot be undone simply because circumstances have changed to your convenience. Lyra is free of any obligation to you, now and forever. And should you attempt to pursue any further claim against her, you will find yourself dealing directly with the full authority of the Cade territories. The threat, delivered with unmistakable seriousness, finally broke through whatever misguided confidence had brought Daniel to this audience chamber in the first place. He glanced between Cale's furious expression and Lyra's steady, unflinching gaze, and seemed to finally understand the reality of his situation, that whatever advantage he had hoped to gain from this visit had utterly failed to materialize. I see, Daniel said finally, his voice tight with poorly concealed anger at this unexpected defeat. I apologize for the intrusion, Your Majesty. I will take my leave. As Daniel and his attendants departed the audience chamber, escorted firmly by palace guards to ensure their prompt exit from the territory, Lyra felt a wave of relief wash over her so powerful, it nearly buckled her knees. Cale immediately turned to her, concern replacing the fury that had dominated his expression moments earlier. Are you all right? He asked gently, reaching out to steady her. I think so, Lyra said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of the confrontation. I never thought I would see him again, let alone have him try to claim me back simply because my circumstances changed. He will never trouble you again, Cale said firmly. I meant every word of that warning. Whatever happens between us going forward, Lyra, know that you will always have my complete protection against anyone who tries to hurt you again. Lyra looked up at him, gratitude, and something deeper, something that had been growing steadily since that first night at the river, filling her chest as she studied his fierce, protective expression. Thank you, she said softly. Not just for defending me today, but for everything, since the very beginning. You don't need to thank me, Cale said, gently cupping her face in his hands. Protecting you, standing beside you. That's not an obligation, Lyra. It's simply what I want to do, for as long as you'll allow me the privilege. As they stood together in the now quiet audience chamber, the confrontation with Daniel finally behind them, Lyra felt something settle deeply within her chest, a sense of closure regarding the painful chapter of her past that had once defined her sense of worth. Whatever uncertainty still remained about her future within Cale's kingdom, about how she might eventually find her place among the formal expectations of court life, she understood clearly now that she would never again allow anyone to convince her that her worth depended on someone else's approval or acceptance. She had survived rejection, isolation, and now this final painful confrontation with the man who had once tried to destroy her sense of self-worth entirely, and she had emerged from all of it, stronger, more resilient, standing beside a king who saw her true value clearly, without any need for her to prove herself through service or sacrifice. Whatever came next, Lyra felt ready to face it, no longer the broken, discarded Omega who had stumbled into the forest that stormy night months ago, but someone who had rebuilt herself into a person of genuine strength and worth, recognized now not just by the man who loved her, but increasingly by the entire kingdom that had witnessed her courage firsthand. Word of Daniel's failed attempt to reclaim Lyra spread through the kingdom just as quickly as the original story of her heroic rescue, and if anything, the confrontation seemed to solidify the court's growing respect for her, rather than diminish it. Where whispers of judgment had once followed her through the palace corridors, now she found herself greeted with genuine warmth and admiration, courtiers and advisors alike, recognizing the quiet strength she had demonstrated in standing up to a man who had once tried to define her entire worth through his rejection. Ruth, in particular, seemed delighted by the turn of events, taking every opportunity over the following days to remind Lyra of exactly how far she had come. "You handled that with more grace and strength than most nobles born into this court could have managed," the older woman told her, one afternoon, as they walked together through the palace gardens. "The whole kingdom is talking about it. The Omega, who not only saved our king but refused to be intimidated by the very people who once cast her aside." "I was terrified," Lyra admitted, though a small smile tugged at her lips at Ruth's praise. "Terror and courage are not opposites, dear," Ruth said wisely. "Courage is simply choosing to act despite the fear. You've shown that quality time and again since you first arrived here." As the weeks continued to pass, Lyra found herself settling more comfortably into life within the Cade territories, gradually learning the customs and expectations of court life, while never losing the practical, grounded strength that had carried her through her months of solitary survival. Chaol made a point of including her in more aspects of kingdom life, introducing her to his advisors not as a mysterious guest, but as someone whose insight and perspective he genuinely valued. "You have a way of seeing solutions that my formally trained advisors sometimes miss," he told her one evening, after she had offered a surprisingly practical suggestion during a discussion about improving supply distribution to more remote villages within the kingdom's territory. "Your time surviving alone in the forest taught you resourcefulness that most people raised within palace walls never develop. I'm glad it's useful for something beyond just staying alive," Lyra said, though she felt genuine pride at the recognition of her contributions. Their relationship continued deepening throughout this period of adjustment, the easy intimacy they had built during those first weeks in the forest, gradually expanding to accommodate the new realities of Chaol's demanding responsibilities as king, while never losing the fundamental honesty and care that had defined their connection from the very beginning. It was nearly 2 months after Daniel's failed visit that Chaol called for a formal gathering of the full royal court, an announcement that immediately set the palace buzzing with speculation about what significant matter required such a formal assembly. Lyra, unaware of exactly what Chaol intended to announce, found herself dressed in formal attire that Ruth had helped select, standing near the edge of the grand hall, as courtiers and advisors gathered in anticipation. Chaol entered the hall with the same commanding presence he always carried, though Lyra noticed a flicker of nervousness in his expression that seemed unusual for a man normally so composed and confident in matters of state. He took his position at the front of the assembled court, and after a moment of contemplative silence, began to speak. "Many of you know the story of how I came to survive the assassination attempt against my life," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "You know that I was found gravely wounded, near death, by an Omega, who had every reason to leave me to my fate, given the cruelty she had experienced from her own former pack. Instead, she risked her own safety to pull me from a raging river, nursed my wounds with skills she taught herself out of necessity, and asked for nothing in return." Lyra felt every eye in the room shift toward her, and she fought the urge to shrink back from the sudden attention, instead standing tall as she had learned to do over the past months, refusing to let old insecurities diminish her presence. "In the weeks since," Chaol continued, "I have come to know Lyra not simply as the person who saved my life, but as someone whose character, strength, and genuine goodness exceed anything I have encountered in years of ruling this kingdom. She has faced judgment from those who valued only status and lineage, and she has met that judgment with quiet dignity and unwavering strength. She confronted her former mate, the man who cruelly rejected her and cast her out with nothing, and she did so not with anger or vengeance, but with the simple, powerful truth of her own worth." He turned then, extending his hand toward where Lyra stood, and she found herself moving forward, drawn by the intensity of his gaze, until she stood beside him at the front of the assembled court. "I have learned, through my time with Lyra," Chaol said, his voice softening slightly as he looked at her, "that true worth has nothing to do with pack lineage, formal status, or the arbitrary hierarchies that too often determine how we value one another. True worth is found in courage, in kindness freely given, without expectation of reward, in the strength to rebuild oneself after devastating loss, and in the wisdom to see clearly what truly matters." He knelt then, before the entire assembled court, taking Lyra's hand in his, and the room fell into stunned silence at this unprecedented gesture from their king. "Lyra," he said, his voice carrying both formal weight and genuine tenderness in equal measure, "you found me broken and dying, with nothing to offer you but a stranger's gratitude, and you saved me anyway. You have shown me, every day since, what genuine partnership and love actually look like, stripped of all pretense and calculation. I am asking you, in front of my entire court, to become my Luna, my queen, and my partner in ruling this kingdom, not because tradition demands it, but because I cannot imagine building any future that does not include you standing beside me." Tears filled Lyra's eyes as she looked down at Chaol, at the man who had once been a wounded stranger in her small forest camp, now kneeling before her with such open, unguarded emotion that it took her breath away. She thought of everything that had brought her to this moment, the pain of her rejection, the long months of solitary survival, the stormy night she had chosen to run toward danger instead of away from it, and every difficult step since that had led her to this unprecedented, extraordinary offer. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion, but carrying absolute certainty. "Yes, Chaol, I will." The hall erupted into applause and celebration as Chaol rose and pulled her into an embrace, the formal ceremony giving way to genuine joy, shared not just between the two of them, but seemingly throughout the entire assembled court. Courtiers who had once whispered judgment, now cheering, with what appeared to be sincere happiness, at this remarkable turn of events. In the weeks that followed, preparations began for a formal ceremony that would officially recognize Lyra as Luna and future queen of the Cade territories, an outcome so far beyond anything she could have imagined during those darkest days after her rejection, that it still occasionally struck her with disbelieving wonder. She threw herself into learning everything necessary for her new role, determined to prove, not to anyone else but to herself, that she deserved this position, not simply through Chaol's affection, but through her own genuine capability and dedication. Ruth remained by her side throughout this transition, offering guidance and support that gradually transformed into genuine friendship, while Chaol continued balancing his demanding royal responsibilities with the time and attention he consistently made for their relationship, never once making Lyra feel like an afterthought amid the pressures of ruling his kingdom. On the day of the formal ceremony, standing before the entire assembled kingdom in robes that marked her new status, Lyra found herself thinking back to that terrible night in the rain, when Daniel had declared her worthless in front of everyone she once called family. She thought of the months of solitary survival that followed, the fear and loneliness she had pushed through one day at a time, refusing to let despair define her story. She thought of the storm that had brought a wounded stranger crashing into her carefully rebuilt life, and every unexpected turn since that had led her to this remarkable moment. As Chaol took her hand before the gathered crowd, formally presenting her to the kingdom as their new Luna, Lyra felt the last remaining shadows of her old pain finally give way to something brighter, something she had once feared she would never find again after Daniel's cruel rejection. She had been cast aside as worthless, told she offered nothing of value, discarded without a second thought, by people who should have protected and cherished her. And yet here she stood, having built an entirely new life from nothing, having saved the life of a king through nothing more than her own courage and compassion, having found love and partnership with someone who valued her for exactly who she was, rather than any status or lineage she might claim. Her rejection, once the most painful moment of her life, had become instead the beginning of a story far greater than anything she could have imagined for herself within the confines of her former pack. She had proven, through every difficult step of her journey, that worth was never truly determined by those who chose to reject her, but by the strength and character she carried within herself all along. waiting simply for the chance to be recognized and valued as it deserved. As the celebration continued around her, music and laughter filling the grand hall long into the evening, Lyra looked up at Cale, at the man who had once been nothing more than a wounded stranger pulled from a raging river, and felt overwhelming gratitude for the storm that had brought them together, and for her own stubborn refusal, all those months ago, to simply let despair have the final word in her story. Whatever challenges awaited them as they built their future together, ruling the Cade territories, Lyra faced them now, not as the broken, rejected Omega she had once been, but as a queen who had earned her place through courage, compassion, and an unshakable belief in her own worth. A belief that no rejection, however cruel, would ever again be able to take from her.